So let's have a look at what it looks like in the browser to start with. I've just made the content a bit wider so I could do some things, but otherwise it looks a lot like it did before. Notice that the background, everything does fit into the area that it's in. So if we look at the CSS, have a smaller height. I've got min height and min width. I have a 1000 pixel width on my content. I haven't specified a height, so it just is as tall as it needs to be to fit everything in it. Considering that each of my sections has a min height of 50 pixels. I think this one has 9 sections instead of 8. Yeah, and that's so I can make a prettier grid. What's that, Vic? So try closing VS Code and reopening it from the directory. Sometimes live server will get confused if you open a different file from inside of VS Code and then kill it and restart it, I find. So I always just restart a session from that directory and run it from there so I don't run into problems. Okay, so what's the grid layout? Creating columns, creating rows, absolute and relative sizing, repeat and auto notation, placing items in the grid with grid row and grid column, and using naming to place items. So this isn't everything that we could talk about in grid. It's the subset that I think is useful, and you can go explore more on your own, just like with Flex and basic layout. All right, so if we specify display grid on a container, that defines that container as a grid, and all of its children become grid items. Just like with Flex, we create a Flex container by declaring display Flex in the container, and all of its items become Flex items. So grid layout contains columns and rows separated by grid lines. Items can be placed into grid cells formed by the grid lines, and by default, the implicit grid columns and rows are created according to the content. Okay? By explicitly defining rows and columns, we can control the alignment of items within the grid and the grid itself. We can control the overlap of items in the same grid location. And with all these things, the grid layout is probably the most powerful way to accomplish complex layouts. You can do really complicated things with grid layout because you have a lot of controls. It didn't work. So you have to, if you run code from the grid directory, so go into the grid directory. So go to the grid directory in your terminal, run code space dot. Yep. Yep, and CSS layout. And to the grid directory, code space dot. Select index HTML and run live server. CD grid, code space dot. So if we just start by setting display grid in content. Yeah, in content, if we set display grid, I'm not sure if this is the right one now. Hold on.
Now, what did you call it?
So in content, all I've done is set display grid. Display colon grid. Now, it doesn't look any different, right? It looks exactly the same. And that's because the implicit grid that gets created is based on the content that we have. And what it's done, if you, in Chrome anyway, if you mouse over the grid container, it'll show you the grid lines. for the grid. Okay, so I can see that I've got one grid column and I have 9 grid rows. I have a grid row for each section. Okay, so that's what I get by default without changing anything, is I get one grid column and I get a row for each section. And so Grid Container will create some implicit columns and rows and will be based on the content that's there. And you can see what it does in Chrome by mousing over the container and seeing the lines. So we can create some explicit rows and columns. Typically with Grid, you'll either create rows or columns and probably set the other to auto. You don't typically create both. So, for example, we can define 3 columns using this grid template columns property. So grid template columns is a property that you can use to create columns. And what you do is you give it a space-separated list of measurements. They can be absolute or they can be relative. So we'll start by creating 3 columns with absolute measurement. So we'll just use pixels. So we're going to create a 200 pixel column, a 100 pixel column, and a 200 pixel column. So let's add that to our CSS. So we're going to say grid template columns, 200 pix, 100 pix, 200 pix. Is that what I wrote? I have a terrible memory. Yeah. Okay, so if I look at what that did, that's really weird. Because my min width is 100. Okay. Hold on one second.
Did it merge the column?
Yeah, I think it's because I've got, there's just a little bit of overlap happening here on because my width. If we make this, if we make those 300, so what happened there was because I've got a width of 100 pixels that I'm forcing on it, there was a little bit of overlap that happened because I also have some margins specified around my item. So then we ended up overlapping in the grid column. So let's do 300, 200, 300. And this is why I don't like to use absolute measurements too, by the way. So if we change this to use relative measurements instead, I'm just going to change this so if somebody goes back and tries it later, they don't get confused. Another option, and a better option, I think, is to use relative sizing, relative measurements. So with Grid, we can use this relative sizing called FR, which represents fractional, I think, fractional size. And what it does is it says, if we say 212, for example, the 2FR will take up twice as much space as the 1FR. And it'll take up all the space that's available. It'll break it up into these 3 sections where the 2 outside sections are twice as wide as the middle section. Okay?
Yeah, but that's not good for Flex.
Yeah, it is.
No, it's not good for Flex because it's overrun my window.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. So if I change these, oh, because we have 1,000 pixel width set. That's why. So 2FR, 1FR, 2FR. Let's use some relative sizing. Oops, I didn't do that right. 212. Then it's going to take up the space that's there. Now, the reason that, Vic, that if I make the windows smaller, this happens is because I've hard-coded a width of my content, of the content container. So if you look here, see how I have 1,000 pics here?
Yeah.
Okay. So if I set that to max width instead, and if I also have a min width set on my items, so that's going to get me into trouble too. Okay, so but you can see that using that relative sizing keeps you out of a little bit of trouble and is a good choice.
But with your media queries, you'd have to get different sizes.
You would. So you would control the sizes of your containers and elements with your media queries, so that yes, if I got below, I wouldn't set the content to 1,000 pixels on a device that's 400 and something pixels wide, right? Because that wouldn't look very pretty. No. Okay, so we did this. I'm going to fix this. Okay.
That wouldn't be the same then, though. It'd have to be 300.
Yeah, you're right. Yes, you're right. That's fine. Yes, you're absolutely correct. That's right. I appreciate that. I do. Okay.
If you want it half that.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So we can also use this repeat syntax. So repeat will allow us to create multiple columns with less words if we want them to be the same size. So we can do things like, say, repeat 3, 1 FR. Or say we wanted to have 6 columns that were like 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Then we could say repeat 3, 2 FR, 1 FR. And it would repeat that pattern 3 times.
Comma there when you never have to have a comma in there.
Yes, because repeat's more like a method call, kind of. Yeah, it is confusing.
It is
We're also using parentheses, which we don't normally, right? So it's not quite the same syntax. So if we wanted to create 3 columns that are each 1 FR, then we could do it this way with repeat. Okay?
What's the math? This is like, so you don't have to do the math, right? You don't have to decide.
If you're using relative sizing, you don't have to do the
Who
maths.
does it? The browser. The browser does the math.
The browser does the
When
maths.
it decides to print the screen, it does the math at that point.
Yes. So another option is to use auto. And auto says you would use auto with if you're using fixed measurements generally. So you might say, I always want this column to be this big exactly, no matter what. And maybe because you've got images in there or something, that you don't want it to get smaller than that size. So you can say, I want this column to be this big, and the rest of it, I just want it to take up the space that's there. Okay? So if I say 200 pics auto, then the first column is going to be 200 pixels wide, and the second 2 columns are going to share the space that's left over.
So can you go 200 pixels, 2 FR, 1 FR? Is that too much?
It does work?
It just means that you'll have that second column.
It'll take up the 2 FR and 1 FR will take up the additional space. Let's do that.
Wow.
Look at that. That's pretty cool, right?
Yeah, that's actually really handy.
Yeah.
So you
What
do that
about-
again. 200.
So 200 pics, 2 FR, 1 FR. So auto would be analogous then to 1 FR, 1 FR.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Which is less ink, right?
it is.
That matters.
Oh, mine's weird.
I don't think it would be less keystrokes to say repeat to 1 FR. So.
Well, say if you had
But sometimes you have,
Things to put in there.
yeah, sometimes you have quite a big grid structure. So the cells might be, some of the cells might be really small, but in order to have more control over how things are placed, you might have a huge grid, and so defining that with repeat becomes really,
Rather than going
yeah, yeah.
Mine's gone like 16.
So you have,
That's cool.
okay, let me see your CSS. You probably have a typo. Yeah, you can tell you have a typo because there's a red line there, so you don't need that. Okay. So repeat and auto. I've never used auto with grid, but it's there. I have used repeat. Repeat comes in handy if you've got lots of columns. Okay, so you can also define rows. So like I said, you typically do one or the other. Define rows or columns, and you let the other kind of grow as it needs to, based on the content. So if we wanted to create 9 rows that are each the same size and take up the space available, okay, then we could do grid template rows repeat 9 1FR. So we're going to get rid of our grid template columns, and we're going to replace it with grid template rows repeat 9 1FR. I think there's supposed to be is there supposed to be a space there now? Okay. So if we look at that, then it looks a lot like what we had to start with because it kind of mimics our default layout. Let's just make sure that that's what's happening here. Yeah. So it looks really similar. We could change it up a bit by saying something like repeat 3 2FR 1FR. And what do you think that's going to do? It looks like this. So every other one is twice as big.
Yes.
Yeah?
That's quite nice.
Yeah.
Except for when you get to, it does the last 3 1FRs?
Yeah, but because it's 3 rows, 3. It's only targeting like the first 3 rows.
It's only
So
two.
repeat 3 2FR. Oh yeah. I need another one here. 1FR. Okay. 2 1 1. 2 1 1. 2 1 1. If I did that, that's better. Or I could do 2 1 2 if I wanted to be. 2 1 2 would be big, little, big, big, little, big, big, little. Yeah.
But it makes it odd then. You don't have a big one already in.
So what I did here was I did 1 1 2.
1 1 2.
Yeah. So if I wanted a pattern with every third row being twice as tall, 1 1 2 1 1 2 1 1 2, then I could type all this out. I could type out grid template rows 1FR 1FR 2FR 1FR 1FR 2FR 1FR 1FR 2FR.
That's really.
Or I could say repeat 3 1FR 1FR 2FR. So that's why repeat's really nice because, like I was saying a minute ago, a lot of times you will end up with a really big grid. It just gives you more control over where you can put things.
That's really weird. Oh no.
Okay, so this is just creating our grid, kind of. Okay, just creating our grid. So we're saying how many columns we want or how many rows we want, and the relative sizing of those columns or rows. That creates the grid. But then we'll want to place stuff in the grid in specific places. So this is where the power of grid really comes in. So in order to place items in the grid, you have to understand the grid layout and the grid lines. Okay, so if I go back to my 3-column layouts with 2FR, 1FR, 2FR, okay, can everybody see that this is what we've got working here? Okay, then I've got these grid lines that are there. And you can see them, like I said, from Chrome. You can see them from Chrome if you mouse over. And then what we can do is we can give a particular section or particular item, grid item, a placement using the grid column and grid row properties. Okay? So to place items in the grid, we either specify the grid row or the grid column, usually both. And the syntax is we say what is the starting grid line and what is the ending grid line for this item. Okay? So for grid row, I say what the starting grid row is and what the ending grid row line is, and for column the same. So for example, if I say grid row 1/3, then I'm saying I want this item to start at the top. That's where grid line 1 is for the row, at the top. And I want it to end at grid row line 3, which means it's going to take up 2 spaces. Okay, so it's going to start here and end here. So it's going to take up 2 rows of space. Okay? And if I say grid column 2/4, it means I want to start in the second column and I want to take up 2 columns. Okay? So looking at this picture, if I did 1 to 3 row, 2 to 4 column, then it would be from here to here. It would be this whole space is what the item would take up. Okay? The item would take up all of this grid space. So right now, without specifying any placement, the default is that it'll put one thing in each spot. But we can say, for example, I want section 2 to take up this whole space. So let's look at an example. So try to do this. So we're going to have to start with grid template columns at 2FR, 1FR, 2FR to match this, to make it look like this. So let's do that first, and then I'll put this back up on the screen. So we're going to go back to grid template columns, 2FR, 1FR, 2FR. Let's make sure that looks right. Okay. Now what I want is I want it to look like this. Now I'm going to give you a hint here. You don't have to place each one of these because most of them are placed where they would be normally. You only have to actually place one of these, and you can probably figure out which one it is because it's the one that takes up more than one row and column. Okay?
So
Now you're going to have to add some CSS. So if you look at the CSS, I've defined, or the HTML, I've defined an ID for each section. So the ID for section 4 is 4. So in the CSS, to give you another hint, it's going to start, you have to start with 4, and you have to put some CSS in there. So another reason that this can be challenging for people, Isaac, I think, people who are spatially challenged, like myself and some other people, it really, like, I really have to think about it, you know. And I know for people who like grasp spatial relations without thinking about it, it's like nothing, you know. Okay, so somebody tell me, what do I have to do? What do I have to do in 4?
You have to do grid row 4,
2, 4.
4, and grid column 1, 3.
Let's have a look. 2, 4, 1, 3. There we go. Look at that. So it's kind of nice, isn't it? Like, it's not too much work to like drastically change the layout, and we're being really explicit about how we want that layout to be. So it's pretty nice. Anybody have a question about that? Is that clear for everybody what we did there?
I did that, but it didn't work for me.
It didn't work for you.
Yeah, I think I might have asked it. So
you have to start off with having grid template columns 2 FR, 1 FR, 2 FR.
Did it not work for anybody else? Anybody want me to have a look? Is it working for you now?
Oh, I see.
Carl?
Right.
Yeah?
Just, like numbering non-inclusive. Like, so if you get 2, 4, it only actually becomes 2 and 3.
So it goes to line 4.
Yeah,
That's it. Yeah, it goes to line 4. Okay? So that's the thing. Yeah. So you have to keep in mind the that you're telling it grid lines, not columns. Not column numbers. Yes, you're not telling it row numbers or column numbers. You're telling it line numbers. Yeah. So if we wanted to take up these sections, then we go from line 2 to line 4, and line 1 to line 3. Yeah. Which is another thing that can be confusing about it. But you just have to remember that it's lines. So look, when I use a grid layout, I like seriously draw it on a piece of paper with the lines and number them. You know?
So using span, I find that to just be a bit.
Using what?
Using span just seems to make a little bit more sense when you're.
Span.
Yeah.
Like the span
But
element?
that's an inline. But that's an inline. But that's inline, not.
So are you talking
So if you go, where you go like grid column 1,
yeah.
3, if you go grid column 1
Span
span 2.
/span 2, it says span 2 columns. Okay, yeah. Yep. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so there is an alternative syntax, which I didn't put in here because I didn't want to be overwhelming. So instead of saying grid column 1, 3, you can say 1/span 2. And it does the same thing. So you're saying I want to start at column line 1 and I want to span 2 columns. So that's an alternate syntax.
That's using both
So what's
ideas.
that span 2 columns? Oh, okay. So they're saying go to the
So you could
Yes.
2 columns online.
Yes.
So could you go start at 2 and span 2?
You could. Yes. So does that make sense to everybody? That's an alternative syntax. If you don't want to just use grid lines, you can say span and the number of rows or columns you want this grid item to span. And that might be more intuitive for people.
Except for if you don't know about that and you know about the other.
That's right.
And then you're looking at that and you're going,
What is that? Yeah.
well, you could work it out though.
And see what happens.
You could
Yeah.
work it. You could
Yes.
work it out because you're starting at 1 and you're going to.
Yes.
And you're starting at 2 and you're going to. You know, like, you could work it out.
So just to make it more fun, is that because using numbers could get tricky, right? Then you kind of have to like keep this drawn out map, you know, where you keeping track of things. And then if you decide to change it, you've got to update your drawing and things like that. So an alternative is that you could use naming. So you can name items with the grid area property and then define their layout using grid template areas. Okay, and this is probably, this is a quite popular way to do things, I think. So let's look at an example so it makes sense. So here's an example where here's my CSS for each one of the grid items, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I took out items 6 through 9 for this one just because I didn't feel like working it all out. So 5 items. And so what I've done is I've named item 1, this first section, header, and then I've named 2 left side, and I've named 3 main, and I've named 4 right side. It's really creative. And I named 5 footer. Okay? So that's what I put in each one of the grid items CSS.
And do you have to put something in your
In your
HTML to get that to happen?
No.
No.
Well, I mean, I have to define these IDs like I did, right? So in each one of my sections, I've given them IDs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah.
So I've got it. I'm referring to those IDs in my CSS, right?
Yeah.
So I use grid area to give names to these areas. Then in my grid container, in the CSS for my grid container, I use this grid template areas, and then you just like write them out the way you want them to lay out. Okay? Yeah. So I'm going to have 4 columns. 4 columns. I want header to go across all 4 columns and take up 1 row. I want left side to take up 1 column in the middle row. I want main to take up the 2 middle columns. And I want right side to take up the right column. And then I want footer to take up the whole row. All the columns, sorry. Yeah, the whole row, all the columns in the last row. And so I made them all the same size. You can tell that, yeah? All the same size, repeat for auto. I could have said repeat for 1FR also, it would be exactly the same. I set grid template rows to auto, and that's just to explicitly tell it to automatically figure out the rows, but I don't think that's even necessary. We can move that off. And then I get this layout. So you can see the benefits of this, right? One benefit is that I'm kind of giving meaningful names to the areas of my page. And then I have this and you can put as many spaces in here as you want, it doesn't care. So you can align it with your spacing, you know, so then you've got sort of like this ASCII picture, you know, of how your content's laid out. So that's kind of nice. And anybody who looks at this CSS, it's quite clear to them what the layout looks like. You can see that looking at this versus looking at 1/2 for grid row and 3/4, you know, things like that. You have to draw it out to work out what is it supposed to look like. But this, it's drawn out for you in the grid template areas. So
particularly when you want to make your areas different sizes like that.
Yeah. So let's try one that's just slightly more challenging. Okay. So try to create this one. So it's not bad. It's not bad. It's not as bad as it looks. Well, look at it. What do we need? What do we need?
4 columns.
So you have to look at it. 4 columns, right? So what makes you come to the conclusion of 4 columns?
Because you got 2 in the middle and 1 on each side.
And we've got these. These are taking up, this is taking up half and this is taking up half, so I want an even number of columns, is the first thing I realized. And the smallest even number that's bigger than the number of columns I have on the row with most columns is 4. So 4 columns. Give it a try. You can do it. I believe in you. So you're going to have to create CSS paragraphs for each one of these sections. Yeah? And you have to name each one of them. It's good to practice. You just do it and you practice. It's not too hard an example, but it gives you some practice. So the first, you're going to have to create, so I want you to do it using grid template area, in grid area. So create names for each of these and use grid template areas to define the layout.
So we have to go 1 and
You need both screens. So we have grid area is the property that you use in each grid items CSS to name it. Okay? And then grid template areas is where you define how they're laid out. So I'll show you back just quickly like this. So each area, notice there's no quotes around the names. Okay? So you name each area. And then grid template areas is where you, and those grid template areas does have quotes for each row. Okay, and just a new line after each one, there are comments.
Area. And content needs
Shall I go back to the other one now? You ready? I mean, I know you have the slides too, but I'll go back here.
How many is this? 9. So you need 9 things.
Do we have to call them 1, 2, 3 above content, or does it matter where we call it?
Should not matter. most of the work is really in just giving everything a name. But it's not really any more work, is it? Because we've got to put, grid row and grid column in there otherwise. So it's really less work. It's your special style. Just figure it out. Nice.
Yeah, well, I guess you have to work out what the
What
color
the,
is.
yeah, what
Yeah.
the would be.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nice. I like it. You have to have a weapon.
Yeah. Just trying to work it out on the website.
Yeah,
How it
good.
all works.
Good. That's good. So do you think you like grid more than flex?
I guess it just depends on what column I'm at.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's it.
if I go with the sections, I want to have frequently really easy to put on.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think also if you have too much like deviation or like special positioning of something,
Yeah.
then grid's much better.
Yeah.
Otherwise you've got to manipulate single items and flex. And
Yeah.
that can be a bit tricky. Yeah. But if you just have like something really simple and it's okay for things to just flow, and you just want to control, whether how they wrap and
So I think
And the
I think
kind of
really
general spacing
appeals to
between
me
them.
more because I want to have one precise.
yeah. Yeah, and sometimes you'll have grid containers inside of flex containers. If you want to control like the general placement of the container on the page,
Yeah.
you can use flex for that, and you can use grid inside to do more exact placement. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well that's not the one, is it? Okay, so let's see
You
what
go
happens.
like into finding placement, you go control it, and that's and then you can go down
You
over
can
to
see
the
a
placement.
red line here, which is color.
Replace all the control elements.
Okay, and the position.
You just go down. That's the kind of replacement. So I guess it's not there. So and then this last one here, you go
This, you don't want this. Don't want
Oh, so when you've done, then you decide to move down.
So what we're doing is practice.
You know what I mean?
Are you sure you're looking at the right page?
No, I love the
Let's just do that.
if you want to see it's like that practice.
Each thing have common quotes or what?
No, not for
Quite
grid
each
areas.
one.
No, grid template areas, you
Each
quote
one.
each row.
You quote each row, right?
Yeah.
Right.
It's trying to do test on this call. Yes.
Oh, how do you go? You want a sec?
what do you want?
Yeah, so that seems to just even popping that open. Pop that open and just watch it again. The only thing it does is I'm sure how to
What are you doing?
see like if I pop that open, what?
You need to have sort things.
You want to name each one, each of
Okay, so seconds, whatever the section you have, name.
give them a name and then
I'm not sure what this is.
is that what you've done?
So what you want to think about it,
What do you want to
what
show
you think
me?
about it is rows.
So then what things is
Okay, so section 1 takes up 1 row, all 4 columns, that's right. Okay, section 2 takes up 2 rows, that's right. And then you have main, right side. So second main,
But it just means that it's imply height and basically.
right side. And then we have third group, and then we have bottom left, bottom right.
Yep.
So it takes up 2
Okay, have you defined
columns.
what your columns are? Yep.
And that's where
That
you're
and
doing
define rows.
And bottom right.
Great.
like with height.
Okay, so it's, where's section 1? What's section 1? Over there.
Okay.
Just inspect your page to see what's happening.
That's all right. So do you see where you have to, like if this takes up 2 columns, just like this takes up 4 columns, you have to list it 4 times. This you have to list twice, and this one you have to list
Down here
twice.
and where the hell it is.
Same thing.
And why? Have you
Yes.
got some other?
It's really annoying though, because when you get something wrong, like the result you see, it's totally out of left field, right?
No, in your text file, like where's
Yeah.
section 1?
So you can have anything. So let's look at
I was wondering why.
That's why the best for the people like that.
Yes, that's that.
But very
You're 1, 2, 3.
it's just more like in the game.
Side one.
I've just looked at like 2,
Yeah, so the name of the like the wall number of columns that is within this
go back to
Okay, so was everybody able to do that? Do you have some?
yeah, we start this stuff.
Okay. So I can see the thing that you look for is does each one of my row specifications have 4 columns? But see, it doesn't. So you need to have main 1, main 1, main 2, main 2. Right? If you don't have the right number of columns specified in each row, it's just like yes. Okay. You
need an expert.
So let's see.
That's kind of the way I want my totally understand why you do
Okay, so yours looks okay from the surface. Looks alright. Section from the right number. That's okay. Now, you have one, and then here, you have there's a different things. Yeah?
I'm still hungry. I'm not even you or Isaac?
So you need to have section IDs defined 1 by 279. So that's the problem that you see in the app. Yeah. So some of the problems that people were having are one, if you don't have the same number of columns specified for each row in your grid template areas, then it's going to look like totally unreasonable. You know, the results you get, you're like, why does it look like that?
I've got mine like that.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And in mine, one is manual second number, and they just put them where they had
Yeah,
to go. They had to go.
That's fine.
It
That's
was
fine.
like, oh, section 1, 4, section 2, 2, section 1, this many, this many, this many.
Nice. Okay, so if somebody is still stuck, you can share your screen up here and we can work through it together if you want.
Did you do it, Sam? So what's your name again?
Doing something else?
Yeah, something else.
Uh-huh.
It seems very difficult at first glance, but it's just like paint by numbers, hey? Literally
Yeah.
paint by numbers.
It is, right?
Yeah.
You just like,
Like
I want
paint this
this to go
2,
this
paint this
way.
1, paint this,
That's
this,
it.
paint that.
That's it. And it is like everything in CSS. You know, like it's super finicky. If you misspell anything, if you, specify 3 columns instead of 4 columns in one of your grid template area rows, if you, misname something, like it's just not going to work. And the result that you see will give you no clue about what's happening. Unless you're much more of a CSS expert than I am, being able to look at something and see what could be resulting in this. Because if you have a misspelling, I think it just will disregard that whole section or something, and then you have to work out if that section wasn't defined, what my styling look like, and that's complicated to me, So it's super picky. I think when you're working with CSS, you just have to be you have to take your time. You have to take lots of deep breaths when it doesn't look like what you expect. And then just okay, something's not right here. It helps to use the inspect tool sometimes. You can look and see, okay, I think this style should be applied here. Let me see if I look at the inspect tool, if I see that style specified, and if not, why not, But, yeah, it's a bit maddening. Did you get it worked out, Tony?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
How about you, Sharon?
Yes.
Yeah? All right. Okay, so that's all I was going to talk about with Grid. There's a lot more that you can do with Grid. It's really powerful. There are other properties. You can actually name, when you define your grid template columns, we do grid template columns and we're just giving the size of each column. You can actually name the grid lines if you want, and then you can refer to the names of the grid lines when you're saying where you want things to go from and to. I like using grid template areas more than naming grid lines. Naming grid lines feels really weird and messy to me. But there are a lot of options. So I encourage you to have a look at the other things that you can do and have a play around. But I think with what I showed you today, you could make some really nice layouts. You could do anything that you might want to do for your portfolio. And hopefully not struggle too much with the layout aspects of it. You have some tools in your toolbox now, I think, that will make that easier. Any questions about that? Okay, so it's 3:15 now. There's a few things you could do. No, she might still be talking, so we could go up and say hi to her. Ash did say she would bring her down. I just assuming that she's still talking. I think she would not do it.
Waiting quietly
Is it
outside.
locked?
It's not locked.
I think it locks
Oh, what?
itself.
Oh, really?
You can't unlock it. It's locked on the outside.
It's really fun.
There's if you want to play with Flexbox some more, there's Flexbox Zombie. If you finished Flexbox Froggy, You can play Flex Spot Zombie to practice it some more. That's fun. There's a Grid Garden if you want to practice Grid. That might be a good thing for us to do. I haven't played Grid Garden. Let's get the link for that.
No, it's just on the same as Froggy, and
Is it?
Garden is